The first half, the contributed session contains the speakers will present some nice theoretical results, and before going to that theory, we have Eric will talk about the stone knives and bear skins, which are actually used, the prehistoric cryptography that is used in practice. Thanks.
So, let's see if this works. Great. So, I'm not a cartographer. I like to tell people I'm a plumber. That sort of, I work in communication security, which has about the same relationship to cryptography as like plumbing has to hydrodynamics, right? Cryptographers build primitives, and we just stick them together and screw them together, and probably the water all drains on the floor. Unsurprisingly, there's a gap between the cryptographic theory and the actual practice that gets deployed. But in this case, the gap is incredibly large. If you look at the cryptographic protocols that are deployed to the internet, they by and large use algorithms which are incredibly old. And in many cases, these algorithms are not only old, but they have either very serious known flaws, or we're using them in ways that are already known to be unsafe. So you might ask, why don't the people building these systems, designing them and building them, why don't they do something about this? And there's a number of reasons. I've listed the 4 high-order bits here, I think. In many cases, it turns out to be easier to sort of apply a Band-Aid to the problem than to actually replace the underlying cryptographic algorithm. So this can be the case because you have an existing system and it's hard to get deployment of the new stuff without breaking everything else. There are often collective action problems where, Ross talked about economics yesterday, where you don't get a lot of benefit by deploying unilaterally until everybody else does. And in many cases, it's been hard for the communication security community to figure out what the actual security implications are from a cryptographic result. So you're using some cipher or using some hash algorithm, and you read some paper on ePrint that says, well, this has been broken, it's been partly broken, it's been shaved down by 2 bits or whatever, and you have no idea what to do with this. And so in many cases, the people designing the communication security systems just throw up their hands and say, well, this isn't seem practical, I'm ignoring it. Or on the contrary, this is incredibly serious and I'm panicking. And this turns out to be, for reasons I'm going to go into now, surprisingly hard to actually repair. So I spend most of my time working on SSL and TLS, so this is a bit of my personal view, but I think it's also borne out by the data that if you look at the internet security protocols, the important ones are kind of like not in this order, but this is not even to scale, right? SSL TLS would take up this entire slide and everything else would be kind of like at the bottom. In terms of actual usage. So I'm mostly talking about SSL because A, that's by and large the protocol is most important, and B, it's the protocol I'm most familiar with, and so I have the best understanding of what the various problems have been. But in many cases, I'm going to say it also applies to other protocols as well, and I'll try to point that out. So if you're not familiar with SSL, it's worth going through briefly how the system works so you understand why things start to go wrong. SSL is a relatively conventional channel-based security protocol with the classic sort of skeleton where you have this sort of key exchange handshake, the key exchange and authentication handshake at the beginning, and then you have key establishment, and once you've done all that stuff, and it takes a couple round trips, once you've done all that stuff, you can actually exchange data. So there's a bunch of messages. I'll go through them very briefly just so it's clear what's going on. So the client so there's a client and a server, and we assume what we're basically assuming that the typical threat model or use model is the server is authenticated. The server is some site that actually has like a real identity, and the client is some random person. The client doesn't authenticate to the server via SSL. They authenticate via a password, basically. So you care you're talking to Amazon. When Amazon wants to know you're talking to you, you type your credit card number into a form. So the client connects to the server, and the client sends this message called the client hello. Let's see if I can make the pointer work. Yeah, there you go. So the client hello contains the client's version. And version is kind of a funny term here because there's a version number. What the client's doing is advertising the highest version of SSL it's willing to support. And this implicitly suggests that it supports the versions that are lower, but there's no way to say I support SSL version 5, but not version 4. All you can say is I support 5. And you also list the cipher suites you support. So IPsec is a protocol that has like a Chinese menu kind of style, where you say, look, I support AES and I support SHA-1, and that means that I support like AES and SHA-1, or you make or you can do them as groups. But in TLS, it's not done that way. There's a single identifier assigned to the whole composition of authentication, key exchange, encryption algorithm, and MAC. So if you, for instance, want to define, RSA with, AES and AES in 128 and 256 modes, and SHA-256 and SHA-1 modes, this is like 4 cipher suites. It's not one, because you have to do the combinatorial explosion. So, and these are listed like nominally ordered priority. The server takes a look at that, and the server tries to figure out if there's anything in common. So the server looks at the client's version, and if there's a version in common, which basically means that the client isn't advertising a version less good than the server's willing to support. So if the client advertised version 1, and the server only took version 2, then this will fail. And then it looks at the cipher list, and it somehow picks one, in some magic way, picks something out of the cipher suite list, and responds as, we're doing this. So the client says, look, I'd be willing to do RC4 and AES and DES, and the server says, well, I'll take RC4. And this is in this message called the server hello. In the vast majority of TLS transactions, they're done with RSA, and they're done with an RSA key provided by the server in a certificate. So they're done with what's called static RSA. It's utterly conventional. The server gives you your key, you encrypt under it. And so, oops. So there's this certificate message that contains like the X509 PKIX certificate chain for the server, and implicitly contains the server certificate. So at this point, what does the client have? The client's seen the server certificate. He knows who the server claims to be, but the server hasn't proved anything. The server's just handed him a certificate that somebody else, that you could have captured from somebody else. The proof of the server's identity is all implicit by the server's ability to crypt the messages sent by the client. So the next thing the client does is he generates a large random number. In this case, it's 48 octets, 384 bits. He enciphers that into the server's RSA public key, and he sends in this client key exchange message. The thing he's sending is called the pre-master secret, and when you encrypt it, it's called the encrypted pre-master secret, which this will come out be relevant in a minute. So at this point, the client has the key because he made it, and if the server is actually has the associated private key, he knows it. So the next thing that happens is that they exchange a MAC over the entire handshake, and this does two things. First, it proves that the server actually has the associated private key, because if he didn't, then he wouldn't be able to complete the MAC function. And the second is it nominally provides protection against message modification attacks of these cipher suite advertisements. So there's a natural kind of downgrade attack, where what the attacker does is he says, well, this client advertised DES and AES and RC4, but I know DES is weak, and I know AES and RC4 is strong, so I'll just remove AES and RC4. And then the server can only choose DES, and so he's now pushed you down to the lowest common denominator cipher suite. So this MAC is designed to prevent that. Like all these protocols, like IPsec, like SSH, all the complexity is sort of in this initial phase here. And then once you've done that, there's a relatively conventional sort of record-oriented backend protocol where you encrypt the records as you go. Though, as we'll see, relatively conventional is a little harder to get right than you might think. So let's start at the beginning. I said this uses RSA. The thing I tell cryptographers that almost always surprises them about SSL is that when they say RSA, what I mean is PKCS number 1.5. So it's not OEP, it's not simple RSA, it's nothing fancy. It's this stuff that's been available for 20 years. It's stuff that's used in SMIME, it's used in PEM. This is basically the first kind of RSA pattern anybody used that worked at all. Now, it's not the case that it uses this because nothing better exists. Quite the contrary. If you go read the PKCS1 standards, there actually are better alternatives. And in particular, there's this thing called OEP, which has also been around for quite a while. This quote here is from the PKCS1 standard, and as you can see, they quite clearly tell you not to rely on new systems that use PKCS number 1.5. They say use OEP. Nevertheless, that's not, TLS was designed obviously before this. There certainly has been no interest at all in moving away from RSA, from PKCS 1.5. So, just a reminder, this is what PKCS number 1.15 padding looks like. We basically start with a 0 to keep the number smaller than the modulus. There's a 2 that's a byte mark. There's a type marker. There's a bunch of random bytes. A 0 to mark the end of the random bytes. The random bytes can't be 0. And then the message itself. So as I say, this is about the most primitive possible kind of padding you can imagine for RSA. And then you take the entire thing and you encrypt it with RSA in the conventional way. So you say, it's the simplest possible thing that works. What could go wrong? And the answer is, it's actually insecure in this context. So back in '98, Bleek and Bacher showed that there's an adapter-chosen ciphertext attack where essentially what happens is that the attacker captures a communication between the client and the server, and he wants to recover the encrypted master secret, or the contents of the plain text. And so what he does is he uses the server as a PKCS1 formatting oracle. So he basically takes the captured message, and he sends modified versions to the server, and looks to see how the server responds. So this only really works in an interactive setting, but SSL is exactly such a setting. And the server is happy to respond to as many handshakes as you give it. So what happens when the server receives this is that either the message is correctly formatted, by which I mean it's got this 0002 structure in the random bytes, or it's not. And by looking at so all the attacker needs to do is determine whether or not the message is correctly formatted or not. And the server will immediately tell him, because the message is correctly formatted, or is incorrectly formatted, the server generates an alert that says, like, incorrectly formatted message. If it's correctly formatted, what the server does is he thinks it's a perfectly valid message, and he continues with the handshake. And of course, now you have some random crap in the lower order bits, which is the nominal key, and the finish macs don't work out properly, and so it's really very obvious, because if the server sends a finish mac, then the message is correctly formatted. So using this technique, you can triangulate in the original plain text. And so the bottom line is that if you observed a connection and you're willing to send about 1 million messages to the server, and the server is willing to respond to them, then you can determine what the key for the connection was. OEP, and this was considered, and so OEP had been designed a few years before this attack was discovered. And so this was considered like a huge win for OEP, because here we had, like, the OEP guys, when they published OEP, said, well, this is provably better than PKCS1, but no one had an actual attack. And now we had an actual attack showing that OEP was actually better, so great. So we have a fix in our pocket, let's go to it. So the natural thing to do would be to go to OEP. This is not at all what happened. Quite the contrary. What happened was that people immediately devised a set of band-aids to apply to the protocol that would allow you to continue to use PKCS 1.5 securely without having to go to OEP. So what do the band-aids look like? Remember, the way this oracle works is you're distinguishing between correctly formatted but bogus and incorrectly formatted messages, so we have to close that channel. So instead of just throwing an error, what we instead do is when we see an incorrectly formatted message, we generate a fake master secret of the right length, and then just keep going with the handshake. So now at this point, correctly formatted and incorrectly formatted look the same. We complete the handshake, and there's just bogus max. So now we've removed the oracle. Somewhat later, Klima showed that there's a timing channel here problem as well. So this isn't a timing channel, this is a version channel. There's another way to get this wrong. And so there's a second set of band-aids you have to apply to fix a second channel Klima showed in 03. So we have a fix. Why did people do this insane thing? Why did they not just go to the right thing? So initially, this was just the most convenient thing to do at the time. So think about the setting. We have a bunch of deployed clients and a bunch of deployed servers. And you're a server, so you're right at this attack. Because the client can't do anything to prevent this attack unilaterally. So going to OEP requires the cooperation of the client and the server. So you have to do a new version of the protocol. You've got to roll out all new clients and all new servers, which will support OEP. On the other hand, this thing I just described can be done completely by the server unilaterally without touching any client. So at least in the interim, as a short term, you have to do this, because it takes months to years to roll out new clients, and the vulnerability still exists. And this was at a time when people thought this was a really serious kind of vulnerability. Since we've gotten, I think, more blasé about it. So moreover, all the data shows that some clients aren't going to upgrade in any case. So you need this countermeasure basically floating around in your server in perpetuity in order to support that whatever fraction of its clients don't upgrade for years. So you have to do that, no matter what, you have to do the countermeasure. So now the question becomes, now we have the countermeasure, okay, in the next version of TLS, why don't we adopt OEP? And there was, in fact, a push to do this, exactly this. So why didn't that happen? So first of all, just classic inertia, right? We have these stacks, and the stacks work, and they've got to fix them, and OEP requires more effort, so why do it? Second, it wasn't clear what the benefit was. There was, here we had a situation where no one knew how to attack the system with this countermeasure in place. And whether theoretical arguments for why OEP was better, no one could actually prove it, and so people said, well, why bother? And finally, it turns out that the extension points the protocol would have needed to negotiate OEP are a lot less convenient than you actually would have hoped. And this sort of brings us to the second theme, which is that the extension points we have don't work very well and make it hard to upgrade anything. So at a very high level, how do you negotiate sort of between old and new things? So you have a setting where the world's full of agents that are all version n. And version n has some capabilities. And we want to roll out version n plus 1. But we want to retain backward compatibility because otherwise people won't download the new thing because it won't work anymore. So we need to have a situation where if you have an old server and a new client, or an old client and a new server, they can still talk to each other. So it's a perfectly classic protocol design problem. And the outcome we want, obviously, is that if there's any old client interaction, you have to get the old version. If there's any new client interaction, if there's two new clients interaction, you get the new version. Very simple. So there are two problems, one technical and one sort of social and economic. The technical one is how do you do this securely in such a way that an attacker can't force two clients who should be who should be down here in this box, in the switch hitting M plus 1 box, back into one of these boxes by convincing them that one of them is an old version and one's a new version. This turns out to be a nominally easy problem in theory, and in practice a very hard problem, as we'll see. The second question, and this is sort of an economic political question, is when do you discard version n? So you'll notice this diagram has nothing for people who are only new clients. And the reason is that in practice, it's almost impossible to eliminate the old clients. There are almost always some old clients floating around. And so as a server or a client, you sort of say, well, if I were to turn off the old clients, the support for the old version, like, I'm going to lose 1% or 0.5% or 5% of my base, why would I do that? And if in fact there is a secure negotiation mechanism, then that's okay, sort of. If there's not, things are less good. TLS, it turns out, has not one, but 4 separate negotiation mechanisms for different aspects of the protocol. The first 3 of these were designed in the beginning. So there's a version number, which is a sort of linear version number, so it's a very gross scale kind of description. There's individual cipher suites, which describe the ciphers you're going to do. And this is to some extent orthogonal to the version number, but not completely. So to give you an example, you can't use Galois counter mode cipher suites with any version of TLS prior to 1.2. And there's just no description of how to do it. And then there's a way for the server to say to the client, look, client, I'd like you to use the following algorithms for when you sign something. And then people realized that, amazingly, this wasn't enough extension points. And so we better add some more extension points. And so there's a whole new mechanism where you can basically, the client can offer and the server can accept extensions in the handshake. So, and these can be arbitrary things. So, for instance, you could say, dear server, I'd like you to use half as long a MAC as you ordinarily would, no matter how long the MAC that the cipher suite emits is. So the unfortunate thing is all these things interact, but they don't interact cleanly. So they're not orthogonal. They're partly orthogonal, but not completely. So given these mechanisms, how do we roll out OEP? So the first thing you could have done is you could have just said, well, we're just going to use, the client will unilaterally use OEP from now on, or the server will. Obviously what will happen if you do this is that the clients will not be able to talk to the servers. That's not an acceptable outcome. So we need some sort of incremental transition. The 2 options were basically do some entirely new version of SSL TLS that used OEP. And this could either have been done with a version, so you might imagine you could do this. But at the time when the Beacon Blacker attack was published, sort of the IETF was in the middle of publishing TLS 1.0. And so no one wanted to do either of, change TLS 1.0 right then, or like immediately turn around to TLS 1.1. So while this might have been an okay idea, it would have been politically infeasible. And even if it were politically feasible, remember that, the version is supposed to be orthogonal to cipher suites, and this only affects one cipher suite. So why are we bumping the version number basically to fix RSA? So that wouldn't have been very attractive. The other mechanism that TLS offered was to introduce a whole pile of new cipher suites that are called RSA OEP instead of RSA PKCS number 1. This is the only really plausible workable solution. But remember what I said earlier about how there's not a Chinese menu system here, right? So at the time, there probably were 25 RSA-based cipher suites in SSL TLS. In order to introduce OEP, you would have had to do 25 more cipher suites, like all with the same names, like for example, you write, RSA or EEP instead of RSA. You could have done this, but it would have been pretty gross. And remember that we still need protection for the old cipher suites. So it's not the case like we have these old legacy PKCS 1.5 cipher suites, and any new cipher suite will be OEP, because when AES comes out, there are going to be people who have PKCS 1.15, and they want to bring AES into the equation, and they don't want to rev the RSA stuff, and they just want to add AES. And so basically we would have been stuck continuing to maintain 2 RSA branches for a very long time. Anyway, this didn't happen. You may sort of be a little skeptical of this claim I'm making that you can never get rid of the old crap. So let me give you sort of an example of a situation where just how slow things actually happen. So in 2006, sorry, take a step back in the story. Debian, the Debian distribution of Linux, as you may or may not know, does not just take packages from people and ship them. What they do instead is they take them and they improve them and ship them. And they check them in their own own CVS repo and stuff like that, right? And so in 2006, the Debian maintainer of OpenSSL decided to improve OpenSSL a little bit. And so he runs Valgrind on it, which is this memory checker. And he finds what's called an uninitialized memory read, which is to say that some piece of the OpenSSL system is reading memory which has not been written by anybody. Now, this is not a good thing, and in some cases this represents a security issue. So he decides to fix it. And he fixes it by commenting out the code with a UMR in it. Unfortunately, this code also is the code that adds entropy to the PRNG. And so the consequence was that the random number generator shipped with Debian for 2 years in OpenSSL had about 16 bits of entropy in the PRNG. So this obviously isn't good. 16 bits is pretty easy to search. So this survived for a couple years until 2008 when Luciano Bello noticed the problem. There was a bunch of coordination failures between the Debian guys and the OpenSSL guys, which is why nobody noticed this earlier. And by then, about 1% of servers on the internet had generated RSA key pairs with this broken PRNG. So now I said 16 bits. There's actually a few more bits of entropy because depending on which version of Debian you were running, things were a little different. And so you'd be pulling from a slightly different 16-bit pool. So when you actually add it up, there are about 250,000 different key pairs you could actually have. But that's not really a lot. And over the course of a couple of days with a computer, you can generate all the key pairs that any Debian machine with this vulnerability could possibly generate. It's very easy to determine whether a system is affected. You just connect to it, you ask for a certificate, it gives it to you, you look it up in the table, if it's in the table, you have the private key, you're done. So this is kind of disastrously bad, right, if you have this. It completely breaks all the RSA cipher suites against any kind of passive attack. Because if you have the private key, you can do anything the server can do. And it breaks the Diffie-Hellman cipher suites against any kind of active attack because the Diffie-Hellman suites are authenticated by the RSA private keys. And there's some fancy passive attacks you can do as well that Havav Shacham, Scott Yellick, and I showed a few years ago. But no one's going to do this, and since everybody uses RSA, it doesn't matter. So if you have this problem, it's kind of actually imperative you do something about it. And you actually have to fix it. So, and the fix is easy. You just upload the new version of Debian, which you probably have anyway, and you generate a new certificate. And many of the CAs would actually give you a free new certificate if you were affected by this. So, this is actually what the upgrading curve looks like. Basically, if you start at the left, some collaborators and I, Havav Shacham, UCSD, and some of the students, basically went and did a survey of systems and watched how fast they upgraded. And remember, this is remotely detectable, so it's really easy to do. So basically, this is the first day of our measurement, which is probably a few days after the vulnerability, so it's missing some of the initial peak. And this is how long it takes things to upgrade. So at about 180 days, basically half the hosts we noticed that were affected are fixed. So here we have effectively a complete vulnerability in the entire system that completely breaks it. And this is what people think is appropriate to do. And it's actually worse than that because this is the rate at which the servers change their certificate. So this isn't quite the same graph at the bottom, but it's very similar. This is the rate at which we observe new certificates being displayed in the same server. And the dashed line is those who are displaying vulnerable keys, and the top line is those who are displaying not vulnerable keys. So this is basically people who are just changing the certificate because it expired. And this is people who are changing the certificate because it's broken. It's not as much faster as you might really like. And even now, you can see a very small fraction of certificates on the internet that are signed by CAs are still vulnerable. Self-signed ones generally are not anymore. Are I believe, a more frequently version. Sorry. Back up. CAs now detect this and won't give you a certificate by and large if you have this problem. So if you have a valid certificate, probably you're not affected anymore. If you have a self-signed certificate, you may never have fixed it. So this is basically the best case scenario, and it's really bad. If you look at measurements of like what fraction of the installed like browser base is still IE7, it's like tens of percents. Okay, so much for RSA. The second thing people find shocking is the state of the hash algorithms. So practically every certificate that you ever encounter is signed by one of these two algorithms, MD5 or SHA-1. So these algorithms are now verging on 20 years old. Even though we've had like SHA-256 for quite a while, nobody uses it. And by the way, of course, there have been attacks on these things. And of course, there's no use of PSS whatsoever. So it's all PKCS 115 again. And there have been attacks on that too, by the way. So as we all know, MD5 and SHA-1 are not in the best shape anymore. MD5 is now completely broken in its collisions with a trivial work factor. As far as I know, no one's got a decent preimage attack yet. And SHA-1 has been very seriously weakened. The latest numbers I see claimed are 2 to the 63 as confirmed. I see Tanya shaking her head maybe, but maybe there's a better number. But I haven't heard a number anybody who's willing to really stand behind that's better than 2 to 63. I think the last time I talked about hash functions at a conference, I think it was like 2008, and I actually expected like that pretty soon we were going to see a SHA collision being published. Shockingly, we have not seen one. I have no idea why that's happened. But even collisions are a real threat to certificates, as was shown so dramatically a few years ago at crypto by the Stevens, Sadorov, Dweger, et cetera, right? Who showed a collision attack on certificates with a real CA. But once again, it turns out that countermeasures are available. So if you have a CA and you have a hash function with collision attacks, you can actually there's actually a very simple countermeasure you can do, which allows you to use a not very strong hash function and still get away with this. Namely, you randomize the version number, the sequence number of the certificate. Luckily, in this case, we actually people didn't do that, and they do it, but they also went to SHA-1. Hang on a second. This is, by the way, the state of the world, which is from Ivan Ristik's SSL survey. The vast majority of things are now SHA-1, but almost no MD5. So this sort of worked in that a lot of people moved from MD5 to SHA-1, but it didn't work, and then nobody moved to SHA-256. Why? So how do we transition to like some new algorithm? Once again, we have this backward compatibility problem. So I'm an authenticating party. I'm like a TLS server, an SMIME signer, or whatever. What do I do? So if I want to talk to everybody, I need two certificates. One with like the old algorithm, SHA-1 or MD5 or whatever it is people accept, the one I know people accept. And one with whatever new thing I have, SHA-256 or SHA-3 or whatever it is, or Skeen or Blake or whatever it finally is, right? But I need to have both of them because the world's full of people who don't take the old hash algorithm. Similarly, the relying parties have the same problem. They need to support both of them, and until basically everybody in the universe has the new algorithm. But unfortunately, going and getting a certificate with a strong hash algorithm doesn't help me. It helps other people. So think about how this attack works, right? The thing I'm concerned about as a server is that someone, I'm Amazon, right? I'm concerned that someone else, that Dan is going to go get a certificate with Amazon in the name, right? But what certificate I have doesn't change how hard it is for Dan to get the certificate, because the way Dan's going to get it is by exploiting a collision and by exploiting the CA directly. He doesn't need me to have a weak certificate to get that. Remember, these are collision attacks, not preimage attacks. So basically, whether I have an MD5 certificate or a SHA-1 certificate or a SHA-256 certificate has no bearing whatsoever on how hard it is for Dan to mount that attack. What I want is for the relying parties, the clients, to stop accepting the weak hashes. But I can't make them do that by getting a stronger certificate. I need to do it some other way. And of course, the relying parties don't want to do that as long as anybody's still displaying an old certificate. So we have this classic collective action problem where the people who can do it have all the wrong incentives. Would that the collective action problem were really the only problem? Unfortunately, we also have this problem where the extension points don't work properly. So TLS uses hash functions in a bunch of places, but the two relevant places here are the places that are hard to extend, are the certificates and the PRF that is responsible for key generation in the middle of the system. It's also in the cipher suites. Thank God we can fix that easily. Fixing the other things turned out to be an enormous hassle. And we only got the design finished in 2008, which is about 3 years after these attacks started to come out. And it's only starting to roll out now, as in no major server supports it, and it'll be in the new version of OpenSSL. That's what I mean by now. So negotiating the digest and the certificate ought to be easy, you would think. The certificates have a digest algorithm field, so it's easy to see from the certificate what the digest is. And TLS has negotiable cipher suites, which have a digest in them. And so you look at the cipher suite, it says TLS RSA with RC4128 SHA. Outstanding. This must mean I'm going to use SHA in my certificate. It doesn't. It means I'm going to use SHA HMAC for the record encryption. There's no way for the client to signal to the server what hash algorithms it supports. So as a practical matter, all the server can assume is the client supports MD5 and SHA-1 because that's what every implementation supports. And this is, by the way, is why it was so easy to go from MD5 to SHA-1 for the servers, because they could absolutely guarantee that any client would accept them. The fix that was immediately apparent was to have a new extension. Remember I talked about this extension thing, where the client would say, these are the hash algorithms I support. This actually turned out to be a lot more fraught than you would have hoped, because of non-orthogonality between the hash functions and the signature algorithms. So in particular, if I say I support SHA-1 or SHA-256, does that mean I support RSA with SHA-256 and DSA with SHA-256? Or what? What the heck does it mean, right? So it ended up, we finally worked out that you had to actually list every combination you supported, which is awful, but it's what we had. That was the easy part. The hard part was the PRF. Sorry. So TLS before 1.2 had this annoying hardwired internal PRF. And the way it worked was that you had two HMACs, one with MD5 and one with SHA-1, and you XOR them together. And this is used for the key generation and for the handshake integrity check. And the idea behind this XOR thing was belt and suspenders. So if MD5 is broken or SHA-1 is broken, you're good to go, right? So even now, this is probably still safe. I know no one who's willing to stand up and say that this is insecure. But it still gives everybody a really, really gross feeling. Because we know MD5's got a problem, and here it's in the middle of something. And there's also some concerns that the US government would no longer allow you to use anything that had any MD5 smell in it anywhere. So people felt they had to do something about this. So TLS 1.2 dealt with this, but no one also felt good enough to pick a new hash algorithm and hardwire it in. It was well, we made this mistake once, let's not do it again. So this was dealt with was by actually having each cipher suite have a PRF indicator telling you which PRF it uses. And the default now is SHA-256, so if you don't have anything, that's what you get. So this sounds like an improvement, and we've gotten rid of this this MD5 and SHA-1 stuff, and we have SHA-256. But if you think about it, it's actually not so great in the following way. Now the security of the handshake, which is designed to prevent you from downgrade attacks, is now no stronger than HMAC SHA-256. So if we jointly support, if we jointly support things that have SHA-512 and SHA-256 as the PRF, right? The attacker can force us down into SHA-256 if you can break SHA-256. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Situation is no better in store and forward protocols like SMIME. So if you have a store and forward protocol, you have, unlike with an interactive protocol like SSL TLS, you have no way of knowing what the peer's capabilities are. So effectively, the only thing you can do is send them a message authenticating with everything you've got and hope they accept some subset of it. So if you have a SHA-1 certificate and a SHA-256 certificate, you send both and you sign with both. But of course, this introduces a whole new class of attacks based on signature stripping. So if you think about it, the classic way people think about exploiting collision attacks is that I'm going to generate two message variants, one of which you'd be willing to sign and one of which you won't. I guess you assign the one you're willing to sign, and they collide, obviously. I get you to sign the one you're willing to sign, I've got a message with a signature that you were willing to generate, and then I pull out the plain text that you signed, and I put in the plain text that's the collision that you weren't willing to sign, and I claim, oh, look, you signed this. If you want, but if you have parallel signatures with a weak algorithm and a strong algorithm, then all the attacker has to do is rip off the strong algorithm and collision with a weak algorithm, rip off the strong algorithm, and he's good to go. So in order to prevent this, you've got to have basically effectively like a pointer to every other algorithm in each signature. So you have the SHA-1 signature says, well, this message has two signatures and one SHA-1 and one SHA-256, and the same thing is true for the SHA-256 signature. And so now you have to have more than a collision, you have to have preimage as well. Okay, so that was all kind of depressing. Let me talk about something that's like a little less depressing, which is the transition, the one thing that actually went right, which is the transition to AES from other ciphers. So all these systems were designed before AES existed. They were designed typically to use DES or 3DES or RC4 or RC2 or whatever. But when AES was first published, protocol support and implementation support was added incredibly rapidly. So, basically the publication of the standards in 2001, and within a couple of years, basically every implementation had something for this. So that went really well. As far as implementation goes, unfortunately, as far as deployment goes, it sort of sounds good. So there's still a large number of popular sites which still prefer RC4 to AES in TLS mode. And measurements show that basically only about 2/3 of servers will even do AES at all. So the difference here is that if you go to Google or you go to Wells Fargo, you go to Amazon, and you offer them both AES and RC4, they pick RC4. There are other servers which you offer them AES only, and they just choke. So if you go to Google and you offer them AES only, they'll take AES. But the other servers, we offer them AES, and they say, oh, we have no common cipher, sorry. So what happened here? The primary reason, as far as I can tell, is simply performance. RC4 is like somewhat faster than AES. And although there's always concerns about the security of RC4, and they give everybody in the crypto community kind of the willies, no one's ever actually been willing to go and like demonstrate that there's a really practical attack against SSLs used with RC4. So given that, and given the sort of general attitude of these ComSec people, they're like, well, why should I change? Why should I make my life hard? So that's the status. So why did this even go as well as it did? The basic reason is that this one time we got the extension points right. That at the time when these systems were designed, the one thing that people knew was there was diversity in encryption algorithms and there was diversity in hash algorithms. And so the protocols were actually designed to be able to negotiate new encryption algorithms and hash algorithms. And so since AES behaves identically to DES and 3DES, except it's a larger block size and a larger block size and a larger key size, and of course a smaller key size than 3DES, it was really easy to just take out DES and drop in AES. And in many cases, implementations would ship with preference for AES. So if you think about how you actually write one of these, a browser or a server or whatever, you've got some SSL stack that you actually build into your server. And obviously you can tell the SSL stack what priority you prefer the cipher suites in. But there's some default order that it just does if you don't tell it otherwise. And so when OpenSSL, for instance, rolled out AES, they made AES the preferred cipher. So if you didn't do anything and you had 2 OpenSSL stacks, you got AES. It wasn't just a matter of being easy. AES also filled a real gap. 3DES was obviously too slow, and there were plenty of people who felt like RC4 didn't really do it for them. And so AES sort of filled that gap. And finally, there was this enormous push by the US government who insisted that AES only be used in a number of applications. And so for anybody in those applications had to support AES. This push is a very powerful force when USG does it, but it's not a perfect force. They try to push a bunch of other stuff on protocols and not done as well. So in particular, they tried to push their own PRNG on TLS, and that didn't work at all. So when I say AES, remember this is like 1992 and 93 the stuff was being designed. What I really mean is AES CBC. Because that was what the popular cipher suite, the popular ciphers at the time were. And as we now know, there's some problems with using CBC if you're not very, very careful. And TLS is especially sort of affected here. And there have been not one, but 2 different sets of attacks on CBC as used in TLS. So the first is that TLS had this thing where basically the IV of packet n plus 1 was the last block of packet n, and that's a problem there. And then also TLS uses authenticate and encrypt mode rather than encrypt and authenticate mode. And we now know there are problems there. So I'll talk about both of these, but what's signal about both of them is that in both cases they both seem to be fixed by countermeasures, not by upgrading the protocol. So the world is full of people that use TLS in these lousy modes, and then there's patches in the system to make it insecure. Start with the CBC padding first. As a reminder, this is what CBC padding looks like. So actually, what SSL CBC padding looks like. So we have some record, and then the last blocks we have to pad. So we have the last bytes of the message. I'm doing 8-byte blocks here just because I didn't want to draw 16 things. We can still pretend we're using devs, right? So we have last 4 bytes of the message and 4 bytes of padding, and the last byte is the pad length, and then the rest of it's filled with a value of the pad. This is actually slightly different from standard padding. Standard padding would have these numbers all be 4 as opposed to 3, but same concept. It turns out there's an attack on this. So say we've captured a cipher block pair, CI and CI plus 1, and we want to figure out what's in block CI plus 1. And specifically, we want to look at the last byte of that. So what we do is we generate a record, basically, where we modify the previous block to tamper with the IV, so that it cancels out what we expect the last block of the last byte of the second block is. And so the consequence is that when the server decrypts it or the other side decrypts it, that last byte turns out to be 0, which is a 0-length pad. And so it says, great, there's no padding. I won't strip any more off. So we have a valid appearing message, at least as far as formatting goes. And then we try to do the MAC, and the MAC fails, and we get a MAC check. But SSL TLS, remember, had different errors for padding errors and MAC errors. And so what you do is you generate this bogus message, and you send it to the server or the client, and you look at the error it generates. And if it generates a padding error, then you know you guessed right. If it generates guessed wrong. If it generates a MAC error, you know you guessed right. Outstanding. And so you can iterate through the bytes one by one. There's also a timing analysis variant of this. So the official right answer to this would have been to go from authenticate then encrypt to encrypt then authenticate. And if you do that, it completely blocks all block tampering attacks. So great. TLS didn't do that. Instead, we put a band-aid on it again. So there's a bunch of countermeasures. Basically, first we said, well, treat all these errors, any message construction error of any kind, record, MAC, whatever, treat it as a MAC error. So great. Then we remove that channel. And there's also a timing channel. So what you do is you do a bogus MAC check, even if the record doesn't format it correctly, to remove the timing channel. So why do this sort of clumsy thing? Well, the first reason is people didn't feel very threatened by this attack. So every time you tamper with a message like this, the consequence is that you get a MAC error and the server tears the connection down. So you only get to basically make one attempt per connection. Also, there are very few settings in which the client and the server are willing to connect over and over and over again and send exactly the same message and allow you to back the data out. Pretty much the only example is the one Vodney used of a repeated mail server login check, and you send the password of the channel in the same place every time. And even then, there's a lot of errors being generated. This, by the way, is not true for DTLS, and there's a paper at NDSS that shows that this implementation flaw is much more serious for DTLS. And of course, back to our old friend, going from ATE to ETA would have required changing both sides, and this could be done by changing one side. There's a whole stack. There's probably about 4 paragraphs in the spec about how to do that, how to do this countermeasure. And if you don't do it exactly right, you got a problem. So that was the first class of attacks. There's also attacks based on predictable IVs. So as I said, TLS used to use this thing called IV chaining, where you basically continue CBC through all the blocks. So what's the scenario for this attack? The attacker is on the wire, and they can observe ciphertext, and for some reason they can inject their own plaintext as well. There's not a lot of settings where this seems likely, but you might imagine that we're behind the same SSL VPN. So I can view the encrypted traffic, and I can inject my own traffic. So the attacker sees some record, and it's got a trailing block B, and that means that he knows the ID for the next block, and he wants to guess some block that he's observed. So I won't make you walk through all the XORs, but the bottom line is that he injects in the plaintext side a a plain text which has been XORed properly with all the right IV information to cancel out the expected IV of the next thing that's encrypted. And then he observes what comes out of the encryption function. And if it matches the record he already seen in the wire, then he knows his guess was correct. So this is kind of unpleasant. But again, it didn't seem very serious. Actually mounting it seemed like you needed incredibly tight control of the channel. Is that me? You need incredibly tight control of the channel, which nobody can figure out how to do except for a VPN. And you need to guess an entire block at a time, which is just not efficient unless you have some really good idea what's going on. So people said, well, we probably should fix this, but nobody got really excited about it. And so while it got fixed, nobody deployed the new versions. Unfortunately, we misestimated how hard it was. And so earlier this year, Rizzo and Duong showed a paper that had, they called Beast, that had 2 improvements on this attack. First, they had a new technique that allowed you to do byte-by-byte guessing, so you didn't have to guess a whole block at a time. And they showed a new threat vector via web browsers that basically allowed you to attack web browser connections. So that seemed bad. It's not as bad as you might think, but it's bad. But this is fixed in TLS 1.1, so no problem. There's a roll out TLS 1.1. And that was, in fact, people's first reaction. And it quickly became apparent that was not going to work for reasons I'm going to get into in a second. So what actually happened was that people were simultaneously rolling out TLS 1.1, and also having this countermeasure that people have invented that, that makes this attack not work in a very clumsy and inconvenient way. So why can't we do TLS 1.1? Oh, I see what happened. Well, I lost that slide. It turns out, so the first reason, of course, is the usual unilateral problem. That is, we have all these clients on these servers, none of them support TLS 1.1. As soon as we roll it out, it takes forever for deployment. The second problem is it turns out that there's actually an active attack on the version negotiation mechanism that can force people down to TLS 1.0, even if they support TLS 1.1 jointly. And that's what this slide should have had. Oh, no, it's still there. Okay. In an ironic twist, authenticate and encrypt actually makes IV prediction attacks harder. So let's say we're in a situation where we want to guess, we want to guess like a single byte, because sometimes I type the byted password, right? So what's the formatting of this message? In authenticate and encrypt, you have the message packed in the cipher block, and then the MAC follows it immediately. But the MAC values are all random from the attacker's perspective because they're generated via some function where you've got a secret key in it. So with authenticate and encrypt, you have to, for any short message, you have to guess the MAC as well, which you can't do. For encrypt and authenticate, however, because you have the encryption function and then just padding, you know exactly what the padding looks like, and so guessing is actually easier. I don't think this constitutes a generic argument for authenticate and encrypt by any means, but I think it's ironic that had we done the nominally right thing when we saw these CPC padding attacks, it would have made this problem actually worse. Which is, I think, more evidence of how hard it is to work out what the impact of things are. So, even if you have the right extension points in the protocol, getting the extension points in the implementation right is really, really difficult. And so, again, the TLS spec, and I'm not going to read any of this stuff, has like 5 paragraphs on how to implement an interoperable TLS implementation with all the various buggy other implementations that are floating around. And one of the things it turns out you have to do is, sometimes you'll simply encounter an implementation which will not negotiate the new version of TLS, but will do it in a broken way. So you send it like a TLS 1.1 handshake, and it gives you a TCP RST back. So now what do? And the only thing anybody knows how to do is they reconnect with TLS 1.0. They just fall back. So this creates an active attack, obviously. The client allows connect to the server, and the client and server both support TLS 1.1. The client sends a client hello with TLS 1.1, and the attacker simulates being a broken server and sends back an RST. The client goes, oh, this must be one of the small fraction of servers which are too stupid to TLS 1.1 in any way, and he just reconnects with a version 1.0 client hello. And at this point, you've forced them back to 1.0, and this whole complicated checks, MAC over the handshake didn't help you because this is an entirely new handshake, so it's got a new MAC. So this basically bypasses all the TLS anti-downgrade mechanisms. You can imagine adding new mechanisms, but this is what we have now. So since this attack we're discussing, after all, does require an attacker is partly active, we can't solve it this way. So you might be saying, why am I using the CBC thing anyway? So CBC was fashionable back in 92, but it's not 92 anymore, so let's do something new. Now, of course, the reason we chose CBC in the first place was that ComSci designers had gotten burned over and over again by using string ciphers, because they kept having problems with nonce reuse and keystream reuse. So, and of course, with the ridiculously weak integrity properties that these things offer. And while CBC doesn't offer great integrity properties, it offers some integrity, by accident, right? So now it seems like CBC is like really hard to get right as well. So what should we do now? I think the emerging consensus, at least what I hear from people, is we should be using AAD ciphers like GCM or CCM or something like that. And probably it is the right answer, but it's worth noting that we've also seen problems with ciphers which don't conceal length. So if you read the Hooked on Phonics paper from, I think it's Oakland this year, they demonstrated that merely by observing packet lengths, you can basically decrypt encrypted VoIP communications with any kind of variable bitrate codec. And so if SRTP used CBC mode, then it would have masked the length of the packet. But because it uses counter mode, it doesn't mask the length of the packet. It makes the attack possible. So here we have a problem where we have this unclear layer separation between ComSec and crypto, where the ComSec people aren't entirely clear on what security the crypto provides. The crypto people aren't entirely clear on what security the ComSec guys need. And the holistic view is very hard to get for anybody who's not like really well versed in both. So I'm almost done talking about fielded systems. So I'll talk about new systems in a little bit. So in summary, why is it so hard to enhance systems that have already been fielded? First of all, as I said, as I've shown several times, many of the extension points don't really work properly. And of course, anything which hasn't been tested doesn't work. And so what happens is you get these extension points which are designed for very narrow extensibility, like for doing, or with very narrow extensibility in mind. So like, we know how to replace ciphers, but we don't know how to replace PRFs, because no one thought we need to replace the PRF, but we know how to replace the block cipher. So if you have a new primitive that looks exactly like an existing primitive, it works great, but if it looks any different at all, you have to change things. So for instance, changing GCM requires a big change. Second, changes in one side are always easier than changes in both sides. And since so many of these things have one-sided fixes, then it's just been easier to do that. And we need those one-sided fixes anyway. And it's become incredibly hard, I think as shown, to figure out what the impact of any actual new alleged cryptographic technique is. And so we have these things where it looks really bad, but it's actually not bad, or maybe it doesn't look bad, but it turns out to be bad in a few years. And so people kind of just don't know when they have to fix them when they don't. Okay, so maybe so we're kind of screwed for like the things we have already, but maybe we can like write new protocols that are better. We don't have to write compatibility, we can get things right from the beginning. So let's look at a new protocol, which is being designed by IETF even as we speak, which is a thing called JavaScript Object Signing and Encryption. The basic idea here is you want a secure messaging scheme, think PGP or SMIME or whatever, but you want it to work well in the web environment for things like OAuth and browser ID and whatever. So there's a huge pile of secure messaging schemes. They're very easy to design. There's a lot of them. And no one wants to use any of them. And in particular, the one that like everyone always wants to push on you, which is SMIME, I can assure you that no one who works in JavaScript wants to use. They all hate ASN1. They don't want to touch it. And they don't really touch anything that has a binary encoding, because binary is very hard to work on in JavaScript. So there's been this new project to design essentially SMIME analogs that are based on JSON instead of being based on ASN or XML or anything like that. And these can be very conveniently implemented in downloadable JavaScript and things like jQuery. So this is sort of what a message header looks like. It's just JSON structure with these incredibly baffling tags and then a bunch of stuff. And everything here is base64 encoded. The basic premise here is we're never going to do our binary encodings, so instead we'll always base64 encode everything. And bloat is not a big deal. And on the surface, they're doing the right thing. So here's the list of the algorithms which Jose nominally supports. As you can see, it's full of modern stuff, cool modern crypto, or at least modern-ish crypto. Stuff that was designed in 1997 instead of stuff that was designed in 1992. So that looks great. This slide in blue shows the things that are mandatory. I think you're going to recognize these. And this one I particularly want to call out because this is CBC with no integrity check. And I want to immediately disclaim, I am working on this project, but I disclaim this. I told them to use an integrity check. people complained. The guys who broke XML encryption this year sent a long message to the list and said, why are you doing this? And this is the answer from one of the co-authors, which comes down to, our software doesn't support the new stuff. This, however, is something we have a fighting chance of fixing. There are a relatively small number of crypto libraries out there, and they're mostly open source. So, and some of them support minor algorithms, or they can be easily added. So one can certainly imagine, and by the way, it's easy, and if it looks like OpenSSL or NSS or whatever, it's not very disruptive to just add a new crypto algorithm. What's disruptive is protocol changes, but the crypto algorithms are easy. So one can certainly imagine me, you, any of us, contributing new good versions of the various primitives to these projects and getting them to adopt them. And I know people have already done that for OpenSSL, but NSS could use it, et cetera. And in that case, at least in that case, in 5 years when the new thing is being designed, that is Jose++, people at least will be able to say, well, these algorithms are OpenSSL, so we can maybe use them. So at the end of the day, what actually causes people to move, either with new systems or old systems? I mean, obviously the first thing is some really serious security vulnerability that I haven't figured out how to patch. So if you actually, if you actually show me something in one of these systems, or me, the world, that is seriously broken and is unpatchable, people will move. And if you imagine some universe where RSA got broken tomorrow, people would figure out how to move to DSA quickly, or EC or something, right? But it has to be clearly explainable, and it has to be something which you can't just fix by patching around the edges. And the history of these protocols has, I think, suggests that maybe it's actually surprisingly hard to find things that are actually that bad. It's much easier if it's a drop-in replacement. That is to say that AES, DES to AES is easy, but if I have to go from, if I have to go from RSA to something which has sort of a different API that requires like different messages being generated, it's harder. And the same thing was true with GCM, where I need to have a per message nonce. That requires changing stuff, and that stuff's inconvenient. Maybe you offer some new capability someone didn't already have. So this is one reason why people started to adopt IBE, even though it's not like a drop-in replacement, because it offers some new capability. But this is harder than it sounds to get right. There have been numerous attempts to add PAKE algorithms to TLS. And in fact, SRP's made it as far as being a bunch of implementations, and yet nobody actually uses it for anything, even though it's quite a new capability and an important one. And of course, also being required by someone really important. So if the US government says you must do it, well, people sort of sometimes do it, but not always. So how bad is all this? I mean, I know this is kind of depressing sounding. It's not good, but I think Ross made a very convincing case yesterday that we have sort of bigger fish to fry. The CA infrastructure is incredibly brittle, and all this stuff depends on the CAs. Even things that aren't TLS depend on TLS for security by and large, in some way. It's surprisingly large, and it's not just a matter of understanding what the crypto does. It's a matter of understanding all the ways in which the crypto is brittle and has to be danced around. So if we're designing new systems, it would be really nice to have a setting where that wasn't the case and where the primitives were much more robust and we didn't have to screw around with them so much. So I think, in the spirit of yesterday's talk by Russ, I think the mission I'd like to ask you guys for help with is, can you figure out the places where the primitives we're using need to be fixed, make a clear case for how they need to be fixed, and show us how to fix them in a way that isn't too painful that we can actually do. Thank you.
So, questions?
Come on, Dan.
I'm just wondering what's next for TLS SSL. I mean, is it done at this point? Is it the end? I mean, assuming nothing else breaks.
Whether we were so lucky. I mean, I think people are hoping we cannot mess with the basic infrastructure anymore. I mean, TLS 1.1 and 1.2 are basically responses to new cryptographic problems, right? And they're responses to, we had to add new pieces of extensibility because we didn't have enough extensibility to deal with the cryptographic problems people were discovering. And I think there's a hope that there's enough extensibility in the protocol now that we can survive some level of new cryptographic research. That said, there's a huge amount of people wanting to do new things that aren't responsive to security vulnerabilities, but other stuff. So in particular, make it faster. And I think a lot of the new work is about making it faster. And by the way, I mean, this is another case of brittleness, right? Making it faster without breaking everything is really hard. And I know we've talked a little bit about how to make, radically redesigning everything to make it much faster by throwing away the existing infrastructure would be easier in some ways.
Okay, so maybe time to contemplate and ask few questions during tea break on the lunch time. So I request Rajiv to hand over this token of appreciation to Eric. For tea now, we'll come back at 11 for the session on protocol. So I request the authors, I see all of them are here, put their slides at the laptop here.
Blomer and May in Crypto 2003 improved this bound up to n to the power 0.725. And Ernest et al. Further improved this bound up to order n. And this is currently the best known partial key exposure attack on RSA. So all these three cases, they consider number of unknown block of D is 1. In this paper, we considered that when number of unknown block is more than 1, what will be the result? So suppose D is this. We know these blocks. So here number of unknown, this is unknown block, this is unknown block. So we have two unknown block. This is our result. Suppose E is order n, that means E is of full bit size and D is less than n to the power delta. Suppose we know number of, suppose bits of D are exposed except n many blocks and each of size gamma I log n. Then one can factor n in polynomial log n but exponential in small n if summation gamma I is less than this bound. So for when this n is large, this attack is not efficient. So here idea of the proof is D is unknown for n many blocks. So we can write D equal to A0 plus A1 Y1 plus AN YN, where A0, A1, AN are known, but Y1, Y2, Yn are unknown. We have RS equation ED equal to 1 plus K phi n, that means ED equal to 1 plus K into n plus 1 minus P minus Q. D equal to this, so we have this identity. Now consider this polynomial. Clearly, root of this polynomial is y1, y2, yn minus k, 1 minus p minus q. If we can solve this polynomial, we can get y1, y2, yn, that means we get D, we get 1 minus p minus q, that means we get p plus q. From the knowledge of p into q, that is n, and p plus q, we can factor n. Also, from the knowledge of D, we can also, there are probabilistic algorithms and also deterministic algorithms by which we can factor n. So these are numerical values. When D is n to the power 0.30, because when D is less than n to the power 292, one can factor in polynomiality. So we start from 0.30. When n is 1, unknown block is 1, then summation of gamma I should less than this, 275. So when suppose n is 1000 bit integer and D is 300 bit integer, if we know 25 many bits of D, we can reconstruct remaining 275 bits of D. When n is 2, number of unknown block is 2. From the knowledge of 30 many bits of D, we can reconstruct remaining 270 many bits. For 3, from the knowledge of 33 many bits, when RSA modulus n is say 1000 bit, then we can reconstruct remaining 267 many bits. So when n large, we needs to know more many bits. So asymptotically, similarly for this case also, for larger D. Asymptotically, when D is less than n to the power delta and delta is less than 0.75, knowledge of this many bits are sufficient to factorize n in polynomial time but exponential in number of unknown blocks. So asymptotically, this result is valid up to 0.75. When D is less than n to the power 0.75, this result is valid. So this is the curve. Suppose D is n to the power 30. If we know less than 20% bits of D, we can factor n. But as long as when D is n to the power 75, we need all bits of D. So this is ratio how many bits of D need to be known asymptotically. These are some experimental results. We considered 1024 bit RSA modulus n. N is 2, that means number of block is 2. Delta is 0.30 when we can so when summation gamma I, that means that corresponds to number of unknown bits is 0.2, we can reconstruct this. We can factor n actually using lattice of dimension 55 with this time less than 2 minutes. When number of unknown block is 3, our result is worse than this case. Using lattice of dimension 91, we can factor n. Next, suppose we know some most significant bits of D, and D0 corresponds that bits. So we can write D equal to D0 plus D1, where D0 corresponds the most significant bit. Then we can approximate K as K0, where K0 equal to ED0 minus 1 by N. So from the knowledge of most significant bits of D, we can get few most significant bits of K also. And this is the result. This result was published in Crypto 2003 by Blomer and May. We use this result in our second theorem. In our second theorem, suppose lambda equal to 0.25. That means we know all bits of D except least 0.25 log n many bits. Then when number of unknown block is when this corresponds to the number of unknown blocks gamma 1, when gamma 1 is 1424, we can factor n. But for larger case, we need to know more number of bits. These are some numerical when we use the partial knowledge of K from the knowledge of most significant bits of D. Next comes to signature scheme using CRT RSA. CRT RSA is around 4 times faster than RSA. Here we have two secret exponents, dp and dq, and dp and dq satisfy edp is congruent 1 modulo p minus 1 and edq is congruent 1 modulo q minus 1. To sign a message m, we have to first calculate sp equal to m to the power dp modulo p, sq equal to m to the power dq modulo q, then signature S can be computed using Chinese remainder theorem from SP and SQ. Suppose there is a fault in the calculation of SQ. That means SP equal to m to the power dp modulo p, but SQ not equal to m to the power dq modulo q. Then it is clear that GCD of s to the power e minus m and n will provide the factorization of n. This GCD will be p. So if there is a fault in the calculation during SP or SQ, factorization can be possible efficiently. This was studied by Bonnet et al. In Eurocrypt 1997. Instead of this direct use of M, if we use FDH coding, that means full domain hash coding, then still this attack can be valid, because SP equal to, in that case, SP equal to HM to the power dp modulo p, and SQ equal to HM to the power dq modulo q, and suppose that there is a fault during SQ, still the attack will be valid. Also attack will be valid if one use probabilistic full domain hash coding. That means signature is generated, but random numbers that are used in the signature are sent are as a part explicitly in the signature. Then also this attack will be valid. So there are many schemes to prevent this attack. One scheme is ISO IEC 97962 signature scheme, where encoding message is μm equal to 6A16, this is hexadecimal, M1 HM hash of M BC16, where M equal to M1 M2 and M2 is the data. That means we want to sign over M2. So signature here will be μm to the power d modulo n M2. In this case, attack will not be valid. So suppose that this attack is not valid. So suppose there is a false during the calculation of modulo q. So s to the power e equal to mu m modulo p, but s to the power e not equal to mu m modulo q. Coron et al. In Chess 2010 proved that if number of unknown part is small, then one can factor n. So here unknown part is m1 is unknown part, hm is also unknown part. We always assume hm is unknown, but we assume that few bits of m1 part is known to the attacker. Then they proved that using lattice theory one can factor n in polynomial time. They also consider two faulty signature occurs for two different primes. That means we have two faulty signature S1 and S2 such that one fault occur during this calculation, one fault occur during this calculation. We have proved that if upper bound of the unknown part is less equal to n to the power 0.3, one can factor n. The previous bound was n to the power 167. So we improved this bound for two faulty signature of two different primes. This is experimental result. We first use 1024 bit RSA, and HM is 160. That means SHA-1. This is, if unknown part of M1 is 74, using lattice of dimension 36, one can factor n. For 2048 bit RSA, if unknown part is 278 bit, then using lattice 36, one can factor in less than 2 minutes. If we use SHA-256, that means number of bits in HM is 256 and unknown part here is 180, then also we can factor in. In these two cases, the previous bound were 12, this case 12, and this case 182. So, in summary, we consider partial key exposure attack on RSA. All the existing results over the partial key exposure was number of unknown block is 1, single continuous unknown blocks. We consider that number of unexposed blocks is more than 1. We also study this signature scheme when with two faulty signatures for two different primes. So, one open problem in this direction is Coronatal consider several signature over same prime. Also, they consider two faulty signature over two different primes. So, one may consider more than two signatures. Some are faulty modulo P and some are faulty modulo Q. So, what will be the bound in that case? So, thanks.
And then we come back at, sorry, 2:30, yeah. So, yeah, before, in fact, now we can start assembling because the photographer is there, so we can utilize the time and so we come back here at 2:30 for this extremely interesting invited talk by Christoph, and then at 4 we will have this. Fine.